welcome everyone. We are looking forward this evening or afternoon for a great enlightening presentation. And with, of course, our speakers, Richard Moss. I would like also to welcome Susan Douglas of Georgetown University. We've been really working together in partnerships for over 10 years. So we appreciate the collaboration. And I would like to invite Susan to talk about the bio of our speaker, Richard Moss.
Okay, so thank you very much. And on behalf of Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, I'm happy to be collaborating with Montgomery College for maybe this is the third year or so we've done this. And I'm especially happy to introduce our speaker, Preacher Moss, who is a fellow educator, a comedian, a writer, a lecturer, a Muslim, African-American, and a storyteller on the corner that shares good news, and sometimes the bad, but always with sincerity. He's a comedian of the times, known as the founder of the program Allah Made Me Funny, the official Muslim comedy tour. Preacher Moss is recognized as the, quote, poor righteous teacher, unquote, from his days as a veteran performer coming up in the comedy industry and college lecture circuit. Allah Made Me Funny toured 30 U.S. cities during its first year and also offered shows in Canada, Europe, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, and the Middle East. And he just came from Australia, I believe, a week ago or so, or maybe even this week. His End of Racism Comedy and Lecture Tour was voted Best Diversity Act on college campuses. And Moss is recognized as an industry standard for being a tough, honest, and brilliantly funny voice on the conversation of race, diversity, and understanding in the world. His unique lecture style has been described as smooth, intelligent, and thought-provoking, and seriously funny, which is why I love his work. Making you laugh and reflect, he's a master thinker, craftsman, and storyteller, and his comedy reminds the old-school art of comedy as protest and enlightenment. As a writer for Hollywood heavyweights like Damon Wayans, George Lopez, and Daryl Hammond on Saturday Night Live, Preacher Moss had proven his value across many levels of stand-up activism and community empowerment. And I'm happy to say I know him as a teacher and as a student of his knowledge of the topic that we're going to do tonight, which is about the connection between Islam and jazz. This program has been made possible by a Title VI grant from the United States Department of Education, which funds a National Resource Center on the Middle East and North Africa at Georgetown University, and by support from the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the Waleed bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. So with that, take it away, Preacher Moss.
That was quite the intro. I'm tired. Thank you. God bless you. God bless you. First of all, I want to thank everybody for their time. This is literally a lecture about time, about keeping time, about jazz time, about historical time, and about Islamic time. And I want everybody to just kind of loosen up a little bit and just kind of think in your mind some of the songs you may have heard that were jazz songs, the things you liked about those songs, the things that also, for lack of a better word, in some regards, have a historical narrative. I'll give you a little story about Dr. Susan and I. I was doing a show on my podcast called The Shout Out Show with Preacher Moss. And I decided to take a piece of work by Marvin Gaye. And what I did was I really broke down the aspect of Marvin Gaye's opus, What's Going On, addressing it as really one of the first spiritual songs, spiritual albums that wasn't necessarily secular, but really encapsulated the time. It was a piece of work, it was really genius. But in that space, it began in my mind for me to be able to look at music as a continuum. So what I would like to do is actually take you back. Not so much jazz lessons, so to speak, but giving everybody a little bit of information where you can kind of connect the dots, not just for Islam and jazz, but Islam in present-day society. It has a lot of impetus. Ironically, doing my research, I actually didn't realize this, that the idea of Islam in America and the idea of jazz in America have a really, really strong connection in terms of time. Uh, the person who's considered basically the pioneer of jazz, like the first jazz guy, is a guy named Charles Buddy Bolden out of New Orleans. He's born in 1877. The religion of Islam that comes to the United States in 1920s is called Ahmadiyya. It's the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam. It started in Pakistan. Ironically, this religion starts 11 years after the beginning of jazz. Well, not the beginning of jazz, but after Buddy Bolden's. So you have somewhat of two parallel lines that are beginning to move and come together. To give a little bit of a background to music at this time, and this is trying to make sure I encapsulate it correctly. The music that comes out of the 1800s is a very specific type of music. A, it's archival, but B, it's carry music. When we say carry music, it's carry music meaning that it carries a burden. And one of the aspects of music that comes out of particularly post-Civil War is a type of music that would later become the blues, but in many regards, it's in the tradition of making sure that people understand that something happened outside of slavery. Like, this is a process that cannot be forgotten, number one. Number two, should not be repeated. So after the Civil War, you have this man who's basically born Charles Buddy Bolden. He's a cornet player. And as he grows older, the music, particularly in Louisiana, the music begins to reflect a little bit more of two things. Number one, the struggle, and number two, the artistry. At this point in time, most of the time, the music that was played, going back to before Bolden, it was for the pleasure of slave owners. Meaning that the music had to characteristically please the slave owner. So two types of music come out. One is gospel, and the other is a sort of like folk type music that would later become the blues. I say blues is what we call carry music in the jazz business because it carries a story. And blues always is almost like a police report for a crime in a lot of regards. You know, my baby left me, my dog left me. You know, something is always happening, but it's under the auspices of, you guess it, racism in the late 1800s going into the 1900s. So what you had was a music that begins to evolve, particularly with the blues. Now, there are a lot of blues records that you can look to, but the formation of the blues, and I'm not talking about the musical formation of the blues, it becomes a lot more carry music because it begins to say something to people who listen to it. Before it's, I don't know, Sister, can Sister hear us? Sister Moya? Can you hear me?
If she logs off and comes back in, it might.
Okay. But I was beginning to ramp up about how we get to jazz and how we get to the 1920s. Two things that should be known, and you already know this, but jazz has a metamorphosis that happens. Two things happen, World War I and World War II. So before World War I, you have the idea of formation of bands. When I say formation of bands, it was musical collectives, which essentially were self-taught musicians most of the time. Some of them learned piano, but a lot of them didn't know how to read sheet music. And you also have the space of congealing bands that travel. When I say congealing bands that travel, I mean that in a local space, they have a lot of what we would say notoriety. People know their words. In fact, the big hit from Charles Buddy Bolden, ironically, this guy is incredibly important in the history of jazz. Guess what though? Nobody has any of his recordings. No one has any of his recordings. You have people who actually remade his songs or redid his songs, like Jelly Roll Morton. His favorite song, and I'm glad my grandmother is on the show, But his favorite song, the hit, was called Funky Butt. That was the name of the song, Funky Butt. And it all was about the idea of people having a good time in a space. It gets very heated. It becomes there's an odor and someone's open the window, open the window, open the window. But it also classifies the fact that this type of music is met in secret. This is not widespread, widely accepted music. He's a bit of an outlier when it turns into music. He's the guy who actually plays free-form jazz. And that's what it becomes. And a lot of people don't know that it wasn't originally jazz, Jazz. It was actually Jass. So you can see where the whole funky butt thing kind of comes in. So in that space, two things happen. You have World War. Now, what I would like to say, and make sure I make a point to say this, is that jazz has a very, very important place in World War I as well as World War II. In World War I, a lot of people don't know that a lot of Black men, particularly Black musicians, went over in the war and they've entertained the troops. This is before the USO and things like that, but they entertained the troops. In fact, I think it was Infantry 369 was a famous jazz group of guys who were largely responsible or credited with forming the basis for jazz for the country of France, as a matter of fact. But in the wake of the end of World War I, what you have is that jazz becomes not just music, it becomes music therapy. In the rush, if you will, or the immediacy of people trying to get back to normal after what was an extremely devastating war, you have people who were looking, and jazz actually fills that space. So it has an acceptance coming back after World War I. People are somehow engaged in it. People are feeling that I can listen to this, I can de-stress to it. I can have a communication with music that I didn't have before. I can have a relationship with music. And this is tied to African-American musicians. So you say that's the end of World War I. What happens pretty much in the next 5 years is the introduction at this point in time of Islam in America in 1920 with the Ahmadiyya movement and, with the Ahmadiyya movement and the introduction of Mufti Muhammad Siddiq. Now, Mufti Muhammad Siddiq is interesting because he comes to the United States, brothers and sisters, he comes to the United States in the hopes of getting converts. But the converts that they're looking for, they're white converts. But the message doesn't necessarily resonate with racial equality and things like that in the 20s. And the people that he immediately draws, ironically, are Black women. And so the scope of American Islam begins in this space with Black women who are looking at this message of equality, this message of international brotherhood and things like that. And they take it home. And what they take it home to is communities that are learning to establish community coming out of course, slavery. The idea of family foundation is a huge thing. So Islam at this point in time is an amalgamate. It's something that people are listening to, but they don't necessarily understand. But one of the features of this religion at this point in time is that it has flexibility. It has room and agency for music. Now, not going into the whole aspect of music being permissible or not permissible, but this religion looks at the people that it's dealing with, almost reflective of a prophetic tradition. It looks at the people who are adhering or trying to adhere to the religion, and it takes in their customs. Now you take that with the fact that you have people who are returning from overseas with a music form that people enjoy here and over there. And so you have a certain type of liberation. by the time World War II comes, you have several things that are going on. And well, here's the major one that's going on. People have a different framing of race identity politics here in the United States. The evolution of music has begun to change. Where we have blues and what I call carry music, now it's identity music. So moving from blues is a language change. It's a linguistic change. Because the blues always says something, brothers and sisters. It says something happened. Somebody did something to me. But in terms of being social music, it never really fully addressed on a consistent level that they were dealing with white supremacy. They were dealing with the, I want to say, the larger aspects of outgrowth or fallout of white supremacy, and it would reflect in the music. But there's a change, and that change is extremely important in terms of how Muslims and jazz come together. So I feel like I'm doing a magic trick, Dr. Susan, but I'm going to pull it together. Two things happen with the space of Islam and jazz. Islam provides at this point in time, in the early 20s, a pathway for people to have exploration of self, that they can develop their own identities. What I said earlier about carry music, blues music, that's the identity. Now people began to develop music away from what was you're entertaining other people. You're making music for other people. They began to make music for themselves. So blues is that evolution, and then it moves slowly into jazz. Now it's aspects of jazz that everybody should know about. It's not just Miles Davis, but you have bebop jazz. You have the larger jazz groups. You have like King Oliver, you have Fletcher Henderson. You have a large amount of people who are beginning to do, this is the era of big band. Now, big band is acceptable. Big band has two things. Number one, it has large employment of musicians, because it's also important to say that the earlier rendition, the early conditions for musicians back in the day was a lot of them could not afford instruments. In fact, the first jazz hit was not by African-American Muslim or African-American musicians. It was by white musicians who were able to play the music because they had instruments. They could afford instruments. And they were the first ones to actually go out on tour. But as the economy shifts coming out of course, the First World War, you begin to have a proliferation of musicians who are able to do two things. Number one, afford musical instrumentation, musical instruction, and they're also able to afford instruments. Because it's really hard to play jazz music if you don't have an instrument. You can think about that for a minute. But it's also the fact that now you have a culture. You have what I want to say, an environment that values this music, even at the early onset. Now, two things I like to say about jazz between World War I and World War II. It's extremely organic. It's extremely accessible. Why is that important? Because when World War II comes, guess what? Musicians are out of work. The materials to make instruments, the ability to travel around and have work, a lot of musicians were just out of work. A lot of musicians went into the armed service to continue playing. But here in the United States, the idea of the big band becomes an economic casualty. So you can't have a 30-piece band or a 40-piece band. It's just not happening. The carry costs of doing that, it doesn't make it feasible. Plus, during World War II, people are not listening to that type of music. However, that being said, jazz has a place in World War II, because guess who didn't like jazz? Adolf Hitler. So playing jazz music at that point in time was considered rebellious. So you had a lot of anti-Hitler Germans that would play jazz, and it filtered. So it became a quiet rebel music throughout Europe, and even here back in the United States, despite the fact that there was an economic crunch for these musicians not being able to play due to the fact it wasn't a priority. And sometimes some people say jazz almost died during this time, and I understand what they're saying, but it still has a place. Now, as you begin to move forward, and I don't want to move too quickly, but as you begin to move forward, there is a school of thought in terms of jazz. We have a smaller band. We have musicians that are a lot more trained. They can spend time and learn how to play an instrument. And even more so, and this is extremely important, they become better at writing music. Being better at writing music means that you can record. Being better at writing music means that you can do publishing and things like that. So now you have a little bit of a economic growth for musicians. It's not just playing music. They become a little bit aware, a little bit more aware about the business, how you cut albums and things like that. And of course, the technology allows them to do these things too. Now, let's talk about Islam and jazz. The Ahmadiyya movement, from all the indications, produces literally the first jazz musicians, African-American Muslim jazz musicians. And you say, why is that? Because a lot of them totally got the whole idea about the message, meaning that they wanted something that was different other than what they felt was oppressive. So it wasn't that Christianity was a problem, it was that Christianity was practiced in terms of white supremacy. I'm sorry, somebody coming in?
Yes.
I think we put somebody on mute. Okay, cool, thank you. So there are a couple of names that you should know that are coming out of the 1930s. One of which is Art Blakey. Art Blakey is the first, the first to kind of take the music and make it a part of his, I want to say, process in terms of not just music, but bringing people into Islam. A lot of the younger, I want to say not younger, but a lot of the other musicians gravitated to this religion because it becomes a part of jazz culture. So Islam at that time is almost countercultural and almost counterfactual to a lot of things that are out there because it creates something that I would say society at this point in time, number one, can't figure out because they can't figure out, they can't really take it away. Even through the fact of World War II, a lot of players were not able to play because they had a cabaret tax. So if you want to play, you're going to pay a cabaret tax and you're going to give away a lot of money. So they had all of these obstacles. But what happens is the matriculation of people understanding that this music gives them a certain type of personhood that they have not, I repeat, have not experienced before. So to speak about the music in a certain way, Islam and the music connects them to the rest of the world. It connects them to the rest of the world. And to have what I would say a spiritual talking points, along with this practice of putting musical expression, spiritual expression in song, it becomes extremely appealing. There are a plethora of guys who are Muslim going back to the 40s, going back to the 50s. And in many regards, they kept their religion and their profession separate for a lot of reasons. But a lot of it had to do with the fact that when you are developing a culture of new music at the time, when you are framing freedom in your music, when you are framing, like I'm a comedian, I tell folks all the time, I don't write jokes, I write concepts. Music is a large concept idea. And the reason is, it leaves spaces and synapses for you to be able to put in your own individuality. So the early masters of jazz are people who are willing to expand the art form, but at the same time, have it be serviceable to the people who are listening to it. And so you have people like Art Blakey, who give you groups, brothers and sisters. Art Blakey is known for Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, which is a phenomenal group over, oh my goodness, 40, 50 years. The Jazz Messengers are still going. Art Blakey has returned to his maker a long time ago. But what was the importance of Art Blakey? The first band that he has under this space when he gets to a point, because he was a drummer, not a very good drummer at the beginning, but somebody, Dizzy Gillespie, bless his heart, teaches him how to be an effective drummer. And from that space, he moves on. But in Islam, to keep culture, he develops a group called the 17 Messengers. Now, if you follow Islam, we refer to Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, as the Rasulullah or the messenger. So he recruits Muslim artists to be part of the 17 Messengers. And what grows out of that space is the music and the contact, not just with Muslims, but people who are not bohemian in the traditional sense, but they're thinking differently. And it begins to lead over into the 40s and the 50s, because there's a fundamental shift from the Ahmadiyya movement that comes in the 20s to the 40s and the 50s, more importantly, the 50s. And that's the fact that people are a lot more aware of their racial identity, and the Ahmadiyya offering at that point, it's lacking for a lot of people because the situations are changing. People have greater expectations, and the theology that's given is not a theology that's necessarily applicable to what other folks are going through or what people are having in terms of expectation and activism. So the music changes. And we get into bebop. And bebop, ironically, produces some of the greatest Muslim jazz artists out there. A lot of people have heard of Charlie Bird Parker. They don't know that Charlie Bird Parker was Muslim. Now, let me say this before we get too far. While they were Muslim, it doesn't mean that they had full knowledge of the religion. You know, it was, in some regards, it was a tangential relationship with the religion, but it gave them a point of pride and a point of reference for when they got together and coalesced these ideas, particularly about music, particularly about religion and spirituality, because at this point in time, nobody's really talking about spirituality in the music. So you have a generation, I would say a 15-year period of the music evolving. And then after evolving, you have a period of the music beginning to ask questions of its society. And when I say that, you know, we could talk about R&B and Motown and things like that. The questions that Motown asks about society are after jazz has asked that question. It's after jazz has asked that question, because jazz at that point in time is a worldwide referendum. And when people would look at jazz and listen to jazz, as my mentor would say, when they would look at jazz, they would look at the condition of the people who were playing the jazz. And so the scope of Islam begins to be, I want to say, a very, very solid bedrock, not just for Muslim musicians, but also for non-Muslim musicians and non-Muslim listeners and appreciate people who appreciate jazz, as well as the Muslim community, because the Muslim community is there, but it's, like I said, it's very, very small. And as you move into the 50s, the music somewhat aligns to the times. You know, one of the biggest traditional shifts in terms of how the music is played, how the music is distributed, and how people are expressing themselves musically happens literally between 1950 and about 1963. So when you take that little space there are some giants that are coming down the road. So you have a John Coltrane that's coming down the road. You have a McCoy Tyner that's coming down the road. You have a Yusef Lateef that's coming down the road. You have not Idris Muhammad, but you have Kenny Dorham who's coming down the road. Now, if you don't know these folks, that's okay. That's okay. But what I want to make sure I'm saying is the Ahmad Jamals and people like that, they are connecting this music to something that's even more powerful. They're connecting it to the African diaspora. In an interview, Art Blakey, the famous Art Blakey, was asked about going to Africa, and they thought he was going to Africa to what? To learn more about the drumming and the music of West Africa. In his interview, he said, no, I wasn't doing that. He said, number one, there was no work. He said, but number two, I needed, here's what I'm saying now, I needed to know more about the religion. And knowing more about the religion allows him, brothers and sisters, it allows him to connect. I don't know if I could really fully express what was going on, but I always, I look at the documentary about Miles Davis. And Miles Davis was hands down one of the greatest musicians ever. But he talked about going to France, and he talked about playing free. What he meant by playing free was he wasn't looking over his shoulder in regards to racism. He wasn't looking over his shoulder in regards to the people who would oppress music, because at this point in time, I'm calling it jazz, but during that point in time, they're calling it race music. And the race music at that point in time was being, in some regards, devalued. But all of these musicians talk about where the music took them. And if we could just focus on that conversation just a little bit, where the music took you, where it took you, where it moved you, how did it evolve you? Because now you have something that was only happening in spirituals, gospel music. And even then, gospel music was a bit more about, I don't want to say it incorrectly, but the gospel music of the 40s and the 50s up into the 60s is a lot about Black suffering. Just the same as blues was about Black suffering, very much about Black suffering. And now you have a lexicon of not just jazz, but jazz vocabulary, jazz clubs, jazz booking. This is a new environment, a new economy that's fresh. And so the combining of Islam and jazz, it's almost like a natural fit. It's very much a natural fit, because they're both, in some regards, particularly with the African-American movement of jazz in the 50s, which at this point in time has moved from the Ahmadiyya movement up into the Nation of Islam. Now it has alignment, if you will, that the people who were playing the jazz now inform the people who are trying to pursue activism as Black Muslims, but more importantly, as Black men and women. So this is not to say that the music in and of itself excluded people. It did not exclude people, but it did have a particular relationship to what people were what people were listening to. I'm sorry, it had a particular relationship to it. And on top of that, jazz was cool. Jazz was conversational. You could talk over it, you could listen to it. It could be held in small spaces. Remember, I talked about the big band where you had to have the big halls. This type of jazz is, smaller hole in the wall clubs with maybe 30, 40 seats. I always remember, shout out to the jazz club where I used to perform, a place called Jazz Estate in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. They never had a crowd over 50 people because they only had 50 seats. So, but let me get back. I don't want to deviate. What happens is the music gets a lot more personalized. It's a lot more personalized. And just like the religion of Islam, it becomes a lot more personalized. It moves away from where it was with the Ahmadiyya movement. And you still have brothers who are still attached to that movement, but the times, if you will, the times are now dictating that we need more, that the activism is a lot more apparent, and the situation that we're dealing with requires something else other than this form of Islam that we were dealing with. This provides an entranceway for the Nation of Islam, the Lost Foundation, even going back to Noble Drew Ali. What do they have in common, though? What they have in common is the fact that the background soundtrack for Islam in the 50s and the 60s is not necessarily James Brown, is not necessarily R&B music. It's a continued steady diet of people who have music that seems to have, I want to say, spiritual tangibility that people can connect to. One of the greatest eras of jazz happens in the 60s, but it also happens with this, I want to say, spiritual reawakening. The whole aspect of understanding the African diaspora, but also, in the words of Brother Malcolm, it's also Pan-African music. This is the soundtrack for Pan-Africanism. So you could play Miles here and you can play Miles in Ghana. And it begins to proliferate and connect people because there are rhythms within sounds and sounds within rhythms. And so you have this outgrowth, for lack of a better word, you have this outgrowth of musical exploration. One of the greatest songs, it's not a song, I take that back. One of the greatest albums that's produced is produced by John Coltrane. The song is called Love Supreme. Now, Love Supreme is a bit of it's a prayer, if you will. It has 4 parts to it, and you can look up the parts, but it has 4 parts to it. It has opening, it has acceptance, it has psalms, it has all these things that deal with the spiritual nature of exploration, how you engage. And the thing about it is it breaks away from the traditional way that jazz is played. This is an album whereby when it's released, the original name of it, believe it or not, was not Love Supreme. The original name of it was Allah Supreme. And he had players on there who were Muslim, who were engaging the same thing, but also the musicality is shared with people who were not Muslim. Like Elvin Jones, who was a drummer, tremendous drummer. But they produced a spiritual piece of jazz work, which today stands as one of the greatest albums ever established. Now, people focus on the album. I focus on the album. But what we don't understand is there are other pieces of work that John Coltrane is producing that talk about the time. He produces a song called Alabama when, in regards to the church bombing, where 4 little girls were hurt, 4 little girls were murdered. He produces that kind of work that resonates. And this is what's important. It's accessible, but it's not necessarily mainstream. But it remains one of the most important pieces of work because they've been building a culture. And the other thing I like to say is that there becomes a little bit of, in 2 spaces, Islam and jazz, there's a little intellectual interplay. It's a little intellectual interplay. The idea that you knew jazz, understood jazz, or even if you weren't a musician, it gave you a little gravitas. Or if you weren't Muslim and you knew things about Islam, it gave you a little bit of gravitas. Because these were the things in the community that were tangible, that people were expressing and exploring over and over and over and over again. So that music, if you will, becomes a bedrock for so many other things. There's a group, we talk about rap music. Jazz produces the first rap supergroup. And that supergroup was called The Last Poets, who produced songs like The White Man Has a God Complex, N-Words are Scared of Revolution, Jones Coming Down, talking literally about, for lack of a better word, talking literally about some of the things that are, one, addressing how they will evolve coming out of the 60s. What are the expectations? They produced a song called Black Soldier. And the song Black Soldier is so powerful because it talks about, again, causality. Because at this point in time, I talked about the blues said, I'm hurt. Jazz says, you hurt me. Islam says, there is a God. I mean, religion at that point said there's a God. Islam says, there's a God, but it's not you. There's a God, but it's not white supremacy. It's not your laws. Like, you can have laws, but I have a spiritual presence that I have to engage. And this becomes the thing that's more and more impressive, not just with Muslim communities, but with non-Muslim communities. The affinity is something I would love to get a grant for and just talk about the affinity of Muslims and non-Muslims connected to jazz and how it grew communities. Over and over and over again, I try to make sure that I touch on these bases. But over and over and over again, you know, the soundtrack for jazz, and let me say this and get it right. The soundtrack for jazz is more so a female movement. And what I mean by that is females, women, you're not going to find a whole lot of female Muslim jazz players going back into the 20s and 30s or 40s. But what you found was women who were singers, who distinguished themselves not as singers, but distinguished themselves as jazz singers. Let me explain the difference. A singer sings a song, the band plays. She's a vocal asset. A jazz singer sings a song, but she's an instrumental asset. And so even in this space, the lead becomes females who literally are blazing the trail. The biggest stars that come out, literally, you can talk about them, but you can talk about Billie Holiday out of Baltimore. And the aspect of Billie Holiday, you know, the biggest suffrage in the jazz community came from women. Now, she was not Muslim, but she was familiar with Muslim culture, which is established up and down. She's familiar with Muslim culture. She was not Muslim, but being aware of these things provides a fascinating outlook or a fascinating perspective on how big is this music. If you think about what I'm saying now, this occurs in a vacuum. There's no internet. There's no internet. There's no Facebook. There's none of that. Literally, the goal and the ability to I want to say increase popularity or increase your work means that you literally have to go around the country. You have to go around the country, all these clubs, to prove your worth as an instrumentalist or a singer. And the amazing part is these cultures, I want to say these generation of jazz musicians, as Muslim and non-Muslim, because I would be remiss if I say that it was all Muslim. Muslim and non-Muslim cooperation in terms of understanding, one, the music, and two, the religion, is something that really has to be established. The story of John Coltrane doing Love Supreme, I said earlier, the original album was supposed to be called Allah Supreme. If you can look at the liner notes, if you can pull them up sometime, if you look at the liner notes, it reads like the opening of the Holy Quran, literally. It is a call and an identification that we have a master, number one. Number two, it also speaks to the fact that we need engagement with that master. And then number three, that we should serve that master. And he talks about it in terms of fellowship, well-being, and attachment. But he does it through music. There's been literally no album that's come out, maybe Miles Davis Kind of Blue, but there's literally been no album that's come out that's been more played, more investigated, more, I want to say, inspected than Love Supreme by John Coltrane. And it changes the course of history. I'll give you guys a little background about Love Supreme. What was funny about Love Supreme was John Coltrane becomes Muslim. Now, back in the day, oh, thank you so much. Back in the day, John Coltrane was living in Philadelphia. He's a Philadelphia guy. At the time, you had widespread, I want to say, Islamic expression in Philadelphia. Muhammad's Mosque number 12 with Minister Jeremiah Shabazz. You had connections to entertainment. A lot of you probably know that was Philadelphia was the home of the first Black Mafia. So you also, and that a lot of people in the Black Mafia were Muslim. So they had engagement with this music, they had engagement with this culture. And again, John Coltrane, before this happens, he's a heroin addict. He's a heroin addict. And somewhere along the line, in reading the book about Love Supreme, he's playing in New York City. Now, he has a pretty good reputation at the time. But, you know, he's dealing with a heroin problem. And he withdraws. While he's withdrawing, he's in New York City, up on 52nd Avenue. People come to see him. He plays horribly. I mean, he's awful. And then he decides to go cold turkey off the heroin. And people say, what was that? Because there's no 12-step or anything like that. He said, I decided to begin my spiritual journey. And the spiritual journey was away from drugs and alcohol and even some of the confines of the music he was playing. And he produces this thing called Love Supreme. People even had a difficult time trying to even frame it as jazz, because it was something that had never been heard before. Something that challenged the mind and the spirit at the same time. You know, the great Dizzy Gillespie talked about Love Supreme. Now, Dizzy Gillespie was not Muslim. Some people thought he was, but he wasn't. But he begins to connect this thing that somehow, at least in this case, for the African Americans that he's seeing, it gives them a pathway to a certain type of freedom and awareness they've never had before. A type of clarity and consciousness that can't be overlooked. In fact, there's a story, great musician, Herbie Hancock. And I'm saying Herbie Hancock because this thing that we're talking about, Islam and jazz, it opened up for other religions. And some people even revisited their religion through this metamorphosis. Herbie Hancock, who is a Buddhist, talks about working with Miles Davis, the great Miles Davis. He's working with them. They're doing a show. Now, for those that don't know, Miles Davis can be very intimidating on the stand. He could freeze you with the look. He might cuss you out, depending on how his day was going. But in this one show, they were overseas someplace, and Herbie Hancock was playing piano. They had all these great musicians, and Miles Davis was going to play his hit song, the great So What? And Herbie Hancock gets so excited that he plays the wrong note, and the note is so bad that everyone who's listening to the music knows it's the wrong note. The musicians know it's the wrong note. Herbie Hancock is petrified, because Miles Davis is a dude you don't do that to. But Miles Davis hears the mistake, thinks about it for a minute, plays a little something on his horn, goes on and plays the rest of his solo. He kills it. And Herbie Hancock introduces this idea, which is almost something out of Quran, if you think about it, if you really investigate what he's saying. That is that all things have creation and purpose. All things have creation and purpose. Our job is to understand how we support creation and purpose, not only for ourselves, but for other people. Because Herbie Hancock gives this wonderful analogy talking about this. And by the way, there were Muslims in Miles Davis' band too. James and Toomey played drums and percussion for Miles. And he's told this story as well. But Miles Davis here's the mistake. He corrects the mistake. He keeps playing. And Herbie Hancock tried to figure out years after what happened. He said what happened was he made a mistake. Miles Davis listened, corrected it, and played the rest of his song. He said, but what he really did was he emphasizes the fact that it is improvisation, that it is free music. And jazz was an entree for free music at every level that you look at, whether it was blues, whether it was Dixieland, whether it was bebop or contemporary jazz, at each station, it becomes freer and freer and freer. And so Herbie Hancock, talking about the reflector, he said, you know, I would like to make this clear. You know, he was Buddhist. He said, but it doesn't matter if you're Buddhist, Muslim, whatever. He said, I want to make it clear. He said, the fact of the matter is, as musicians, they have all helped each other in a very spiritual and tangible way. Because John Coltrane doesn't get to be called John Coltrane playing free unless he spends time with two people, Thelonious Monk and Ornette Coleman, who are outliers in terms of music. They reframe what music can be from the piano and the horn. And they spend time with John Coltrane, helping him reaffirm, number one, his playing style, but number two, his right to play spiritually throughout his music. It doesn't happen. And so you have a generation after that that looks at this model. And as Herbie Hancock said, and I keep coming back to him, he said the interesting part was to Miles Davis, that mistake that he played to Miles Davis, it wasn't a wrong note. It was merely unexpected. Can you think of the gravity of that? That it wasn't a wrong note, it was merely unexpected. And we live lives that are framed by things that are unexpected. And can you think about the whole scope of everything I've told you of Islam and jazz, understanding that at every turn, at every revolution, at every generation, it becomes freer and freer. And people begin to think of their own presence in this country through music, that they become freer and freer. That society, you're able to ask the questions and you're able to pursue the questions you have. When of course, when Art Blakely talks about going to study Islam over in Africa, this is a metamorphosis. This is a metamorphosis that people, and I'm going to try and frame this as succinctly as I can, but jazz music created a culture of students of knowledge. Islam, theoretically in credo statements, also has a characteristic or personality that you become students of knowledge. And so you have both of these coming together in this musical sound, because now when you're listening to music, it's not your music. It's your opportunity to listen to what someone is saying musically, the choices that they make musically. So the language are harmonies and melodies and syncopations that allow us, if you will, that allow us to think freely. So, you know, I'm sorry, Dr. Susan, we're already almost at 5:30. I apologize. I think I need to allow for some questions, but let me just say a few things and then I'll allow for some questions. So everybody, I apologize. I know I went straight hours, so forgive your brother.
Would you like to share some clips of music or just a sample from maybe Love Supreme?
I do have it, and I don't mind. I don't mind doing it at all. Hold on a moment.
And for those of you who are listening, I put the link to the liner notes from Love Supreme in the chat. And it is remarkable, exactly as Preacher Moss says.
So it's 4 parts of Love Supreme. So it doesn't even sound like a jazz album. It does sound like a spiritual recipe. Love Supreme, part one is acknowledgement, where you'll hear the actual chant. It goes between Love Supreme and Allah Supreme. You hear Love Supreme. And part two is resolution. Part three is pursuance. Part four is song. And let's just put it out there. Black spirituality was not a big thing back in the 50s and 60s. It was religiosity. So let me know. I hope everybody can hear it.
Yes.
Yep.
So you can hear it. Some of the East, some of this influence from the East in it. On piano is McCoy Tyner, who's also Muslim.
Mhm.
So Dr. Susan, I wanted to play something from Coltrane before he does Love Supreme. You can hear the difference. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
All right. This is one of his favorite albums. My favorite things.
Hey, it's Robbie here, and I'm with my girlfriend Mariah, and Mariah is actually using my
Okay,
three-step
Mariah.
freedom business to make thousands.
It's drastically different. So it's actually it's pretty nice. um and the music that we had from Love Supreme, it's music that's consistently asking a question, uh, and it's looking for the universe to give it an answer. And I think that was the two biggest things I want to make sure everybody knew, pull from that. And overall, you know, there's music that there's music. Actually, I did a comedy special called Love Supreme and Anatomy of Gratitude, which actually was a tribute to John Coltrane, because when I decided to take my journey to Islam, I think I listened to that album probably about 2 days straight. No words, nothing, but it gave me this musical accompaniment for my one of very, very important decision in my life. And it also filled in the fact that I was a wannabe musician. I'm a comedian only because I was a bad musician. How about that? But I would also you know, encourage. I'd encourage everybody to please uh, explore the music. Explore the music. It's a very rich tradition, and the idea of Islam and the music is they inform. This is probably one of the few cases where the religion informs the music and the music informs the religion in terms of the African American experience with jazz. So I'd encourage everybody to check it out. And don't think that you have to listen to 61. This goes all the way back. Art Blakely, Ahmad Jamal, uh, one of my favorites, Idris Muhammad, who's a drummer, Yusef Lateef, who really expanded the whole idea of sound and things like that. I don't want to put his stuff up right now because that would probably take we'd be here till tomorrow. But I'm going to encourage everybody, please check out Yusef Lateef. Let me be respectful. If anyone has any questions, please. I tried to leave some time. So, Dr. Susan, if anybody has any questions, please. Oh, okay.
Great.
There's a question from John to Teacher Moose.
Yes.
Did John Coltrane ever visit East Africa or Asia before he wrote Love Supreme?
I think he goes afterwards. I'm pretty sure he goes afterwards. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he goes afterwards. He releases Love Supreme, but he contracts stomach cancer. He dies shortly afterwards.
Oh,
but he was engaged in, at that time, all of the world religions. So there's always been a question whether Coltrane was Muslim or not. Having a good authority, his wife said that he was Muslim. At the time, though, the ideology of Islam in America in the 50s and 60s, particularly through the Nation of Islam, is not, it's more a social movement. So it's not Sunni Islam or Orthodox Islam. It's a Islam that informs personhood. It informs self-respect and community building and family. So,
yeah.
All right.
Hamza, would you like to? Hamza, I has two sons, age 13 and 10, play trombone and sax. They are in jazz band at their schools. I took down notes, and I am excited to share this information with them. This is lengthy. If you could read it.
It's all right. Ramadan Mubarak to you, brother. You know what? JJ Johnson. Have them listen to JJ Johnson. Slide Hampton, great. I think was Hampton. I have to look, but JJ Johnson is amazing on trombone.
If you have any other recommendations, just send it to our emails with Susan, so we could just share it with the group as well.
I think I'll come up with a nice little listening list that everybody can kind of check it out, because there's just so much music out there.
Of course.
There's just so much music out there. And I think the other thing is, we oh, you already got it. Cool, cool. I think the thing is the music is not relegated to just Muslims.
Of
Is that
course.
you had that collective, like per se, Art Blakey with the 17 Jazz Messengers. It eventually went to the Jazz Messengers, and it wasn't exclusive to Muslims. In fact, the one of the Wynton Marsalis was a jazz messenger, and you have such, but the music does have a very strong connection to the religion, though,
Mhm.
for sure.
Anyone else like to ask a question directly? I'll look if you want to raise your hand in the reactions button.
Come on. Yeah, everyone.
Don't be shy.
While someone will ask question, Richard Musa, I loved your quote about understanding diversity and multiculturalism requires that we eliminate or reduce the anxiety of our ignorance and how to speak honestly when we cannot. I really appreciate that quote very much. And of course, I saw in your bio a lot of awards, tied with diversity and equity as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I have had the fortune, while I wasn't a great jazz musician, I tried, but I really had great experiences being able to hang out with jazz musicians. I'm going to throw another with jazz musician. Actually, I had him on a Friday reminder. Look up Frank Morgan.
Oh,
Frank Morgan, I love something. I think when he passed, he was Muslim, but he was the heir apparent to Charlie Bird Parker, who was identified as Muslim. Of course, Bird had a very long history of drug abuse with heroin. Actually, Frank Morgan winds up having heroin addiction as well. There's a movie that came out about him, but you have to get it off of one of these offshoot streaming services. If anybody could look up the documentary on Frank Morgan, you will thank me later.
Definitely. Any questions? Anybody?
I don't think it's planned anymore, but you can look up chasing the train on John Coltrane.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I was active in the 80s and 90s, and I quit when I was 30. But my friends were all going to France. They were moving to France. My black friends. They were moving to France, and they were actually developing their careers in France. Do you know anything about that? Was that a historical kind of thing where jazz was parallel developing in France and giving a lot more opportunity to people in France?
Jazz gets introduced to France with the First World War. So I was earlier I was saying that it's not documented enough, but you had legions of jazz musicians that fought in World War One, and they entertained the troops. So you have like Infantry 369. I'm trying to remember if they were out in New York or not, but they're credited with really laying the foundation for jazz in France. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading Miles Davis saying something about that too, about when he went to France, he was so shocked that the people were so well educated about the music.
Yeah, but I was thinking about much further up, like in the 80s and 90s, because I know that
I think it's the same. It's the same appreciation for the music. Because you have a lot of guys who are not jazz musicians, but if it seems if there was it seems that there was an appreciation where you put in time on, what would be this type of music in some regards, indigenous type of music. These guys have second careers overseas.
Well, I thought it was interesting because a couple of them came back and they told me that in France they're not black,
This is true.
They're just musicians. And I thought that was
This is
great.
true. This
Yeah.
is Miles Davis talks about that. He talks about going to France, falling in love with a French girl, and being depressed about having to come back to New York.
Mm.
So you're 100%. You're dead on. Absolutely.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I just found the Frank Morgan story and put the YouTube link in the chat. Any other questions?
Feel free to ask me.
I think it's time to go to France.
I went to France, but it wasn't the cool part of France. So I'm gonna try and go back. I think I was
How
staying
were
at
you
the,
in?
I don't know. I won't say that on the show. Just wasn't. I didn't like it too much.
Well, you know,
Um,
things have changed too over time, and the 20s is not the 2020s.
Yeah, and I think I had a rough start with a cab driver that was trying to rip me off. So it just went down from there. But the people were very, very nice that I dealt with. It was just a couple people that weren't that nice. And I was only there for a short time, so I can't judge it. I think it's just my experience. However, I did manage to salvage the trip by going to a jazz club, and I was a happy guy after.
Is there any other clip you'd like to share with us as we finish up here? We've got about 10 more minutes.
Hold on a minute. Do I still have the screen?
You can always share the screen.
Okay, let me get Yusuf Latif. Okay, let me get.
Don't forget that
This
tick
is-
box.
Yeah, this is called Eastern Sounds, but Love Theme from Spartacus. You can hear some of that experience we were talking about with Train. You can hear it here, and he really, really embraces it. He actually remained Ahmadiyya, and he advocated. He preached that. He advocated it. To the end of his life. So he's quite a landmark. But you can kind of pick up the chord progression on the piano, how it builds. It's really, really pretty. but you can see where he kind of lays out. There's a chord progression that he has, and he kind of lays it out. The notes are longer. Um, the music is a little bit more engaged. I think it's endemic of the music that comes after Coltrane. And with Yusef Lateef, he actually says, "Hey, I'm Yusef Lateef. Like, I'm Muslim. Here's my name. Here's my music." So he's a pioneer in that way. But also, he was amazing. He was an amazing sax player. May Allah be pleased with him. Incredible sax player. So you can kind of see what the progression is, and because I could play some music, and it's very, very syncopated, but it's not what it came out to be. You had musicians that played in those bands that were Muslim, but we engaged some people who actually led bands, Coltrane, Yusef Lateef, and we have a couple of folks. But I think that's a good sampling for right now, and I'll work on that. I'll work on that list for you as well.
So it's really great.
It's very beautiful music.
Yeah, lovely. And of course, we didn't really have time because we know, like, it's a big topic to talk about, little bit about Ramadan, but we didn't have the time.
Yeah. I don't want to hold everybody. I really appreciate your time and your patience, because it's a very big subject.
It's lovely. We really, all of us, enjoy it. Thank you.
And shout out to Brother Maurice. So it's amazing. It's like I said, I've been listening to jazz since I was a kid. So my mother says there's no. I love the Last Poets, and I loved Coltrane when I was little. So my mother's like, we played it when you were born in '66. So her mind's like, you're a Muslim. No, I'm not surprised.
They will need to get you back in here to talk about Motown next time.
Okay, we're gonna probably need 2 hours for Motown.
Sure.
I forgive me. I felt like I had a lot of notes, and I'm still looking at them. I'm like, we didn't get to them. I mean, but I think, in the words of the great Johnny Griffin, the saxophone player, who told me he said, "You're a funny comedian, but you sound horrible." He said, "You have to practice the 3 B's, which is be brief, brother." So I will try to practice the 3 B's with this class.
Well,
Too many B's.
We wanted to give you enough time to stretch your wings out, and
yeah, definitely, yes.
Yeah,
it was really great.
I really enjoyed it. Again, thank you so much.
Well,
our pleasure.
Can we give you a shout out to about the shout out show?
Yes, the shout out show is on Facebook, Facebook Live, Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube Monday through Thursdays. We will be going to 7 days a week for Ramadan, Preacher Moss Ramadan 30 for 30. So we will be on all 30 days during Ramadan. So
Susan,
that is his podcast, right? Was that born out of the assignment, or was that something you had done before?
When we started, that was the first. Yeah, I started it during the COVID, and we were like, I'm going to do a 30 for 30 because you got to stay creative or you lose your mind. And we just kept doing it. At one point, we had done 514 consecutive episodes.
Oh my gosh! Okay.
So when we were talking today about jazz and Islam, I'm like, I feel like I'm doing a couple of episodes. I should have done a part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4.
Yeah, definitely, yes. I think this would be great, educational and.
So next time we'll come back, we'll do Islam and hip hop. How about that, Sister Susan?
Would love that. Good. Really would love that. Our students love that.
And we'll get some Muslim artists on, and you'll be surprised because the second part of this is how Islam and jazz fed modern hip hop.
Hey guys, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm hijacking Sherry's laptop. I was
It's
downstairs
okay.
in my studio.
We knew you're not Sherry. We can call her.
I just came upstairs and I heard what was going on her laptop, and I stopped to listen for a second. And I just want you guys to know, I just came out from my studio in the basement. I just produced my own album. I wrote all the chord progressions. I play keyboards, bass, percussion, guitars, and my music is right in the pocket of what you're talking about right now.
Hey
So,
man, send us a link. Can you send me a link?
I already
posted
put the link in the chat.
You put it in the
Sherry
chat.
put it in
Okay,
for us.
great. Thank you.
All
Yeah,
right,
please.
I'm on it.
Covered
I'm on
action
it.
music.
I love it.
It's exactly what you're talking about.
I love
Wow,
it. Thank you so much for sharing.
All right.
that's wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Now I'm going to
Yes.
get beat up by Sherry for.
We're not gonna tell her. Don't worry.
Okay.
We're gonna
Here she comes.
learn about it later.
All right. Love it. Love it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's 5:59, and we really appreciate it, Preacher Moss. And
Yes.
definitely we'll have you back again.
All
Yeah,
right.
definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank
All
you.
right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Have a
Wa
blessed
alaikum
day.
Alaikum salam. and
Alaikum
Good night,
salam wa
everybody.
rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And
Thank you.
Ramadan
Ramadan
Mubarak.
Kareem.